I've thought recently that thought is actually secularized prayer. I'll tell you why I believe that. I truly believe it's the case. There's endless reason to believe that the religious enterprise per se preceded any attempt to formalize thinking. We don't really have any records of formalized thought as such, let's say, prior to the Greek philosophers, prior to Socrates in particular, who taught people to think. What were people doing before that at a psychological level? Well, they were engaged in some variant of a religious enterprise. There were no faithless people in the distant past. The manner in which people interacted with the world was a religious manner. There was no alternative to that. People might have debated with one another about what the appropriate faith was, but everyone existed within a conception of the world that we would regard today as clearly religious. What do you do when you think? Well, the first thing you do is you admit that you don't know something. Right? So that's a gesture of humility. If you want to think about something, we have to have a problem. It has to be a problem you're interested in, let's say, or a problem that bothers you, a problem that plagues your conscience or calls to you. You have to have a problem. You have to accept that problem as your own, so that's a move of responsibility. And then you have to proclaim your ignorance, not least to yourself, right? Because if you have a problem, you have a problem because you don't have the solution. And if you don't have the solution, then you're not everything you could be. Not least because you have the problem. And so then what do you do? If you're thinking, people say, well, I thought up this, or I thought of this. And it's a strange way of apprehending what happens, because when you say, I think, it's not like you know what you're doing. Right? You don't know how you think. You have no notion whatsoever of the causal sequence that allows you to conjure up something essentially out of nothing that addresses something that you didn't know. And it's a complete bloody mystery. It's like, think about it this way. If you didn't know the answer, then how could you think it up? Right? It's the same problem obtains when you dream. It's like, obviously, that's not a voluntary activity. Where did the dreams come from? Well, they say, well, they happen in my head. It's like, in there in the goo, that's the idea, is it? It's a very weird way of looking at the situation, because the disjunction between the dream as a phenomena and the matter of your brain is so great that attempting to casually reduce one to the other is, well, it's just a non-starter. It's preposterous in some ways, and we certainly don't understand the relationship between conscious or unconscious experience. Say if dreams are more on the unconscious side, we don't understand that in the material substrate of the brain at all. And there's been decades now of pretty intense work on consciousness from the neuroscience perspective. It isn't obvious that we've really got anywhere at all with it. It's a great mystery. So anyways, you're thinking away. What do? Well, as I said, you admit that you have a problem, so that's a gesture of humility. It's also a confession of sorts, right? Is that you don't know. And you have to admit that to yourself. So this is what scientists do when they're thinking. You have to grapple with the fact that you're bereft. And then what do? One of the things I learned when I was a scientist was that scientists lie about science all the time. It's built right into the scientific process. So when you publish a scientific paper, you write the introduction. The introduction describes how you generated your hypothesis and why. And all of that's complete nonsense. Because what you do is you tell a story about how you reviewed the literature and how it sequentially influenced you to logically take the next step forward and come up with the research question in mind. That isn't how it works. Ever, or virtually ever. First of all, if your research question is so obvious that you could have just derived it from a review of the literature, it hardly is original or worth pursuing. So there has to be a leap of originality in there somewhere that isn't accounted for by the mere facts. The truth of the matter is that you have a hypothesis, you have an intuition, you have an insight that something might be the case. And you get that because you admitted in ignorance that you didn't know, and you received something that approximates a revelation. That's what an intuition is. That's what an insight is. That's what it means to move towards illumination. Those are all words with a religious connotation. That's where scientific hypotheses come from, right? And sometimes they strike people even with the force of revelation. Is that the greatest of scientists in their autobiographical accounts often insist upon the fact that they're struck by a realization, right? It's very strange language. It's like, well, where does that realization come from? It's the same question as where do your thoughts come from? Well, what you have to do to think, at least in the initial stages, you have to admit that you don't know. And then you have to, well, what? You'll have to want to know. Well, there's no real difference between that and Christ's injunction in the Gospels, right? The injunction from Christ is that you should knock and the door will open, and you should ask and you'll receive, and you should seek and you'll find. And that's all predicated on the idea that you're actually knocking, right? That it's a gesture that indicates an intent to walk through the door, and that you're actually asking because you want, and that you're seeking because you want to find. It has to be the genuine article. And then what is the consequence of that? And the consequence is, well, something appears in the theater of your imagination. That's a much more accurate way of describing what happens than that you thought it up. So you thought out your dreams, did you? That's why dreams can contain information that you don't know. How do you account for that? Well, is it necessary to portray it as a revelation? Well, it's a description. If you want to attribute it to the workings of the unconscious mind, go right ahead. But it's not like you've made any progress in solving the problem. You've just replaced one mystery with another. And so I think that the biological and the divine dovetail, and if you want to take a bottom-up approach to the problem of revelation and attribute it to something like an implicit unconscious that emerges out of the material realm but has its own structure, it's like, well, go right ahead. You're treading on religious ground when you do that anyways. Not just treading, you're fully there. And certainly people like Carl Jung realized that by like 1930, and that was part of his beef with Freud, because Jung realized that the God that Nietzsche had dispensed with in some sense made itself manifest anyways in the unconscious. And he was absolutely right about that.